Hi, my name is John Lavasser, and I'm going to be doing a presentation on MMR, vaccination, and autism. A little bit about the background. A study in 1998 linked MMR vaccination to autism. The study was widely publicized and fueled the debate over regular recommended childhood vaccinations and their safety. The study, however, was based on only 12 cases with no controls. The information was gathered from the parents after their children had been diagnosed as autistic. Several of the authors later retracted their findings, and the researchers were investigated for fraud. Despite all these flaws within that study, fears still linger today about vaccination in general. Anecdotally, every week I seem to run into at least one parent that does not want to vaccinate their child over fears of autism or just general potential for an extreme adverse reaction. This is worrisome for me in my situation because I'm in the state of Hawaii, where there's been about 1,000 cases of mumps diagnosed since March 1st, 2017. This has led us in the public health arena to go ahead and recommend an MMR vaccine outbreak dose for any patients without 2 documented MMR vaccines or to adults who haven't had an MMR in the last 5 years. So right now we're going to review a study that examined the potential link between MMR and autism. This study is important to review because if there is a link between MMR vaccination and autism, then obviously we would probably want to forego getting MMR vaccination if it poses extra risk for the child. The study that we're going to look at was titled Autism Occurrence by MMR Vaccine Status Among U.S. Children with Older Siblings with and Without Autism. So authors examined whether or not there was a difference in the ASD diagnosis rates between MMR vaccinated and unvaccinated children. They chose their cohort from an administrative claims database. The index children had to be born between 2001 and 2007 to be included in the study. The index child had to have at least one older sibling also enrolled in the claims database. So children who have an older sibling with autism spectrum disorder are at higher risk to develop ASD. Therefore, authors are seeking to generalize results to people already at risk for ASD. A little bit about the population of this study. The children were vaccinated for MMR or not vaccinated by MMR, and they were stratified by age. So 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 5-year-olds. And they were also stratified by the ASD status of the older sibling. Just to clarify, ASD stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder. All right, let's go into the study sample. So you can see the study's sample size here, about over 95,000 children. Over 1,900 had an older sibling with ASD, and over 93,000 had an older sibling without ASD. If the older sibling had 2 claims associated with ASD or pervasive developmental disorder, that's PDD, the index patient was considered to have an older sibling with ASD. If the index child had a sibling with no claims associated with ASD or PPD, then they would be included in the group titled older sibling without ASD. For the index child to be identified as ASD, they would have to have at least 2 claims associated with ASD or PDD. Children without an older sibling enrolled in the claims database were excluded from the study. Children who only had 1 claim of ASD in the identified time frame of the study were excluded as well. They also excluded children who had a sibling with only 1 claim related to ASD. So a little bit about the demographics. About 75% of participants were white, 4% were black, compared to 13% in the US population, and 9% were Hispanic, compared to 17% in the US population. So here we can see that underrepresentation for minorities. This may have been an issue because some studies have shown that higher rates of ASD among minorities is common. So let's go on to the statistical analysis performed. So risk ratios were calculated in ASD children receiving either 1, 2, or no doses of MMR. Children at 5 years old were grouped as either 1 dose, 2 dose, or no dose. Cox regression was used adjusting for sex, birth, year, region, race, and income of the parents. And in the results, we see that none of the risk ratios were significant. And we're going to see that on the following table. here is the table for the results. We can see right here on this side we have older siblings without autism spectrum disorder, and here on the right side of the screen we have older siblings with autism spectrum disorder. And you can see, looking down this column p-values, that none of the risk ratios at all were significant. Oh, sorry, this is the unadjusted column, and here, adjusting after controlling for all those things mentioned earlier, you see that none of them were significant. Same thing here, adjusted p-values, nothing significant. Interestingly enough, when we look at the p-values in the unadjusted column, we see that one right here, children at 5 years old with 2 doses, risk ratio of 0.44. That's compared to unvaccinated children. 0.003 was the p-value. I mean, if this had been significant, this would show that there was actually reduced risk for MMR or autism after MMR vaccination, but that's not the case because adjusted p-value, you can see, was not significant. So the conclusions of this study, moving on. So even for a population who is at higher risk for developing ASD, MMR vaccination does not increase the likelihood of developing ASD. The study concludes this is true for 1 and 2 doses of MMR. They did see a relationship between MMR vaccination status in children with a sibling with autism spectrum disorder. These results indicated that parents who have one child with ASD are foregoing or putting off getting the MMR vaccination for their younger child. This kind of shows us that the fear of MMR vaccination having a play in autism spectrum disorder is still present today. And so in my personal opinion, I would agree with the author's conclusions that they're valid. It seems like the risk ratios were not significant in any of the cases, and most of them, the risk ratios were below 1. But yeah, although those results were not significant. But I would agree with the authors on this study. So even though I agree with them, there are a few biases in this study. So let's go on to the observed biases. So selection bias. 1, there was only insured participants involved. So what does that mean for us, that only insured participants were enrolled in this study? Well, research has shown that African Americans are underinsured. As noted earlier, in this study, they're actually underrepresented. But also research has shown that African Americans and minority communities are more likely to have a child diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So that could have affected the results. A differential misclassification may have been present. Authors acknowledge that their vaccination rates were lower than national averages. Participants who were labeled as unvaccinated may have actually got their vaccination from a school or other public health entity that did not have to make a claim for the vaccination. This would lead to people who were actually exposed to the vaccine being placed in the unexposed group. There also may have been a non-differential bias leading to incorrect categorization of information. This would have resulted due to the data collection method they used. Participants were categorized as ASD or not ASD based on whether they had 2 claim codes that fell under the umbrella of ASD or PDD, or if they had no claim codes at all related to those diagnoses. This may have led to misclassification of index patients or of their older siblings. Authors acknowledge that the method they use has a positive predictive value of 87%, meaning that 87% of the time when someone has 2 claims for ASD, they will later be diagnosed as autistic, which means that they may have mislabeled some, possibly. Even with these biases present in the study, ASD rates among the total population were similar to the US, and the ASD rates among people with an older sibling with ASD were similar to the US as well. But how generalizable is this study really? Let's take a look. So we would say this is generalizable to children enrolled in private health plans for an extended period of time. The participants in this plan were largely white, and most came from households that made over $75,000 annually. Therefore, the results can be generalizable to mostly white, upper class or upper middle class children. This study is probably not generalizable to the uninsured, underinsured, or more ethnically diverse, or the lower socioeconomic classes. due to the underrepresentation of Blacks, Hispanics, and uninsured individuals. So what would be the ideal situation so that we can generalize this to everybody? I call that the ideal / unethical situation is randomly assign participants to receive MMR vaccine and follow and record their development of autism spectrum disorder. So obviously this would be unethical if we actually had a fear that MMR vaccine was related to ASD, then we wouldn't want to just give it out to people at random. And also knowing that MMR protects from some childhood diseases, we don't want to withhold that from certain people. So although that would be the ideal situation, that probably won't happen. So in conclusion, overall, there is no increased risk for ASD in people vaccinated with MMR, even when looking at children who are at a higher risk for ASD. These results, they can be generalized, but not to an ethnically diverse population or lower socioeconomic status. And fear of ASD developing should not stop parents from MMR vaccination. Here are some of the references we examined during this study. And this concludes my presentation on MMR vaccination and autism. Thank you.